Today we're going to be learning Sukkah Daf Kaf Aleph. It's the daf for the first day of Chag Sukkot. We're going to start at the bottom of Kaf Amud Bet. So what we saw in the last daf was, the last thing we saw was a question that if you hold that you can't sacrifice nidarim and nidavot, voluntary offerings on Yom Tov, what if you did anyway? So Rava had said, you throw the dam al manat latir basar b'achila. This is ochal nefesh, basically, because part of the meat gets eaten. So for the part that gets eaten, you're allowed to sprinkle the blood so that you can permit the meat. Without sprinkling the blood, you're not allowed to eat the meat. That's ochal nefesh. Rabbi Bar Rav Huna said, zoreket hadam al manat latir murim la'erev. You can sprinkle the blood in order to permit you later on, after Yantiv ends, only after Yantiv ends can you do this, but you can burn the parts that are supposed to be burnt on the altar, not related to the food and the eating of it. So the Gemara is now going to ask a question on Rabbi Bar Rav Huna. Meitive, we're now 4 lines from the bottom. Kivsei atzeret. This is the sacrifice they would bring on atzeret, on Shavuot. Sheshchatan shelo lishma. You did it for the wrong reason. You slaughtered them not l'shem kivsei atzeret, but for the purposes of some other sacrifice. Oh, sheshchatan lifnei zmanan, ben lifnei zmanan, ben lachar zmanan. Or you did it before Shavuot or after Shavuot when it wasn't the holiday, in which case you don't fulfill the obligation of the kivsei atzeret. Right now, we're not talking about Shabbat or Yantif or anything. You're doing it not on the right day or not for the right intent. In general, this means you generally, other than a few exceptions, if you do something shelo lishma, we had a whole discussion about this in Pesach, and Pesach was an exception, but you continue to sacrifice it, you just don't fulfill your obligation. So if this happens, hadam yizarek v'habasar yachel. So you still sprinkle the blood and the meat can still be eaten. You just continue and go along with doing the sacrifice. You just don't fulfill your obligation of having brought the kivsei atzeret. V'im hayta Shabbat, but if it was Shabbat, lo yizrok, you can't sprinkle the blood. Okay, now this is going to be, we're going to see it's very similar to the example of Yom Tov, something you shouldn't have brought on Yom Tov. You did anyway, sacrifice. Are you allowed to bring the blood, right? Both of them said you could, but depending on the reason. So now they say, v'im zarak, hurtza amanat laktir imurav la'erev. But if you did it anyway, you sprinkle the blood anyway, then you're allowed to burn the parts of the sacrifice that are supposed to be burnt after Shabbat ends. Im zachak, notice it says, right? But if you did it anyway, that means that means ideally you're not allowed to sprinkle the blood. It's only if you did, then it's okay. So what do you see here? So Bishlam ala Ravanicha, for Rava, this makes perfect sense. Why? You don't eat the kivsei atzeret. So there is no food, and or the truth is, it's not even that. It's that you're not going to eat the meat because it's Shabbos, right? You can't eat the meat. You can't cook the meat on Shabbos. But he said that you're allowed to do it in order to permit the parts that need to be burnt that night. If you don't sprinkle the blood, you can't sprinkle the blood at night, and then you can't burn the parts on the altar because you haven't finished the process. So you'll never be able to do that really because you can't do it the next day. The blood is already left overnight. It's a problem. So basically, Rav Huna makes no sense because according to him, you should be allowed to do it l'chatchila, not only if you did, but you should be allowed to because it permits the burning of the meat, of the parts on the altar. So they say kasha, right? In fact, this is difficult. However, the Gemara now brings a second an option of answer. Notice they were comparing Yantif and Shabbat. You could say that we're more strict about Shabbat, and that's why on Shabbat you can't do it, l'chatchila, the sprinkling of the blood, but you actually could do it on Yom Tov. So maybe there's reason to distinguish, and maybe that's why. We're now going to have an interesting story. Rav Avia, the elder, asked Rav Huna a question. What if we have a partly owned animal, a Gentile and me? Can I slaughter it on Yom Tov? Amar le mutal. He says, yes, you can. Amar le. Why is this? Rav Avia Saba says, but why is this any different than nidarim and nidavot? Why can't you do nidarim and nidavot? Because really, nidarim and nidavot partially belong to God, partially to you. Like part of them get eaten, part of them don't. Because of that, we're going to say that, right? It's like owned by, right? The Kohanim actually get parts of it, if I remember correctly. But the point is that the Kohanim, right, they can eat part of it, and God gets part of it. So part of it is ochal nefesh, and part of it is not, because obviously what goes to God is an ochal nefesh. So why wouldn't we say the same thing with this slaughtering that's partially, right? The nidarim and nidavot we're not allowed to do. We're not permitted mishum ochal nefesh, even though part of it gets eaten by people. And yet the one that's partially owned by a Jew and a Gentile, that we can. It's almost like mocking it because that's got God involved and we're not allowed to. So why should we be allowed to here if the Gentile owns part of it? So Amar Le, what's his answer? Orva parach. There's a raven that's flying over there that just flew away. Okay, this is when I was growing up, right? We'd always say, oh, right, we want to distract them. Oh, look, there's a bird. And then they look and they say, oh, I made you look, right? You try to see if someone's gullible enough to go look. He was trying to distract him basically and say, oh, look, there's a raven flying, and hopefully he'll forget about what he asked. Very strange reaction, response of Rav Huna to this question. And in fact, Kinafik, when Rav Avia left, he didn't really respond to the strange response. Maybe he succeeded in distracting him. We don't know. But when he left, Amarle Rabba Bure, Rabba, the son of Rav Huna, the famous Rabba Rav Huna, he said, wait a minute, what just happened here? Right? Lots of times things happen in your house and your kids say after they leave, like, what was that all about? I didn't understand what went on here. So he says to him, Lav Hainu Rav Avia Saba, Demishtabach Le Mar Begave Degava Rabahu. Is that not Rav Avia the elder, who you always talk with such respect to? How did you treat him like that? How did you just ignore him and make this, some people actually say Orva Parach was an insult to him almost, and they explain it a little bit differently. But the main point is, how did you respond that way to him? So his answer is even more interesting. Ani hayom samchuni ba'ashishot rabduni b'tapluchim. Okay, I am like this pasuk in Shir Hashirim, okay, which basically means that I need, okay, the way Rashi, I'll go with Rashi's explanation. He says, today was Yom Tov, v'darashti l'rabim, I went and gave a big shir, v'chaliti mitorach hadrasha, I was exhausted from giving this big drasha. And I say about myself, samchuni b'ashishot, haviu li seuda ve'esod, I needed some food, I was starved, I couldn't focus on what he was asking me. And he said, he asked me something that I really need to think about. Like, I didn't have a clear answer right away, and I just wasn't focused, right? I know I could tell you this, after teaching in the morning, Shiur in Hebrew, a daf Shiur in Hebrew, and a daf Shiur in English, when I'm done with that, I am so exhausted. If you ask me a question, it's going to be a little bit hard for me to answer because, right, your head is in so many different things, and I haven't eaten yet breakfast, I'm starved, right? It's exactly that. So we all know, whether it's from teaching Torah or whether it's from all sorts of things, there's always moments in the day or moments in the week where somebody asks you something and you say, listen, this just is not the right time. Okay, but still doesn't really answer the question because he could have said, I'll get back to you, right? I'll look into it. I don't have the answer off the top of my head. Still a little bit odd, his reaction, and maybe he was embarrassed to say, I don't know the answer, right? This is something teachers always have to learn, that it's okay to say, I don't know the answer right away, I'll get back to you. So anyway, he says now, the Gemara says, that's kind of the end of the story. The Gemara now says, V'tamamai, so really, what is the reason? Because the point is, Rav Huna didn't say there is no reason, he just said, I need to find it. So what's the reason? An animal that's partially owned by a Gentile, partially by a Jew. Mutar l'shachta b'yom tov. Why? Part of it belongs to me. I'm going to eat a kazayit of that meat. The only way I could do it is by slaughtering the entire animal. So I do one act of slaughtering, which permits my part of the meat. It happens to permit his part also, but I wasn't doing it for him. But why? When the Kohanim get to eat it, it's not because this meat belongs to the Kohanim. It all belongs to God, in which case there's no ochal nefesh here. It's just that the Kohanim get to eat on the table of God. But that's not something, we can't make food for the table of God on Yantiv. That's why you're not allowed to do it on Yantiv. Amar Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda comes and says, he says the same thing that that we answer, right, that Rav Huna said. He gives the reason that we just saw a minute ago that the Gemara gave, which is you can't slaughter an animal, right, your own meat without slaughtering the whole thing. But if you have a dough that's partially owned by a Jew, partially owned by a Gentile, you can't knead that dough and bake the whole thing because there you can split it. You can split it for kneading. And right, sometimes I do this. I make a big batch of challah, but I split it in half and I knead each half separately just because it's easier to knead it that way. So likewise, here you could just easily split it and say, you need your part, I'm going to knead mine. And your kneading then ends up being for his sake. So you can't knead the whole thing. Mativ Rav Chana Bar Chanila. He brings a question though. What does he say? Isat klavim. Bizman. Okay, there was something here called a dough that they used for dogs. Okay. So bizman sharoim ochlim mimenu chayev bechala. This is bread you make for a dog. If the shepherds or the people that handle the dogs, right? Roim is usually shepherds, but they mean right the workers eat part of it also, then we're going to have all sorts of laws associated with it. The question is, do we call this bread or do we not call it bread? For there's all sorts of ramifications for all halachas. Like chayev bechala, you have to be mafresh challah then. If humans are eating it, basically, then you have to be mafresh challah, separate the challah part that goes to the kohen. Me'arvim ba u'mishtatfim ba, you can use it for eruv tavshilin, for eruv tchumin, for shitufei mevaot, eruv chatzerot, all of those eruvs that we learned about. Mivarchin aleh, you would make a hamotzi on it. Mizamnim aleh, you would make berkat hamazon on it, the grace after meals. Vin efet b'yom tov, and you can even bake it on Yom Tov because it's food for humans. V'adam yitzei bo yedecha v'tov b'Pesach, and it's matzah. You can actually fulfill your obligation on matzah with it, no problem. V'amai, now go back to this baking on Yom Tov. Why? If it's partially for the ro'im and partially for the dogs, you should say v'ha'ef sharle l'miflaga b'lisha. You should split it in the kneading part and only knead the part for the humans, not for the dogs. So why did they allow it if they didn't allow it with the Gentile? So they say shani isat klavim ho'il ve'efshar lefaisam b'nevela. The dough of dogs is different because the dough of dogs, yes, it's designated for dogs, but it could be you'll find a dead animal and you'll give him that, and the dog would much prefer the dead animal than the meat. So since there's a possibility, this is what we call ho'il, since it could be that you might eat the whole thing on Yom Tov, therefore we allow you to do it on Yom Tov. So that was how he explained Rav Chisda. What's the problem? According to this, Rav Chisda holds by this concept of ho'il. Now we know, we learned this before. The ha'itmar, okay, this was learned already way back when, but we learned it in Pesachim. It says, ha'ofemi yom tov lechol, if you cook on Yom Tov for the next day, a weekday, Rav Chisda amar lokeh, Rabba amar eno lokeh, right? This will be classic for today. Okay, today's daf is for Yom Tov. If I were to cook today for, right, today's daf is Tuesday's daf, I'm cooking today for Wednesday. I'm not allowed to do that, right? Why? I get lashes for that. Rabba amar eno lokeh. Rabba says, no problem, you don't get lashes. Rav Chisda amar lokeh, why? Lo amrina. We don't say, ho'il lo mikla ele orchin, chazele hashtanami chazele. We don't say, well, maybe guests will show up. So I'm cooking now for tomorrow, but maybe I'll need it for later today. We can't say that. Rabba amar eno lokeh, amrinan ho'il. Rabba says we hold by ho'il. You could say, since maybe guests will show up, you're allowed to cook today for tomorrow because maybe you'll end up needing it today. So how do we explain Rav Chisda? Ela lo tema ho'il ve'efshar. It must not be what you said, since maybe a nevela will show up, a dead animal, and you'll feed that to the dog instead and you'll eat the bread. It's not that. Ela kigon di'ile nevela. Divadai efshar lefaisam b'nevela. It's a case where you have a nevela, you have a dead animal already. And then you can make the whole isav klavim because you know that you're going to be the one ending up to eat it because he's going to eat the dead animal. Now they ask another question of Rav Huna. We were talking about Gentiles. So now what if a non-Jewish army comes into town and they demand that you cook food for them? Are you allowed to do that on Yom Tov? Bnei Baga are the people in the village, a village in the south, that they were supposed to be making the bread for the Bnei Chela, for the Chayalim, the soldiers. Can you do it on Yom Tov? Amarle, Chazina, you check. If they have, they're nice people. So, I mean, they can't be the nicest people, but if there were a little kid that were to go to them and say, oh, can I please have a little piece of that bread? The Gentiles will give it to the army, will give it to the boy, the child, the girl, child, whatever it is. If there are those kind of people that would give it to a child, then you're allowed to because maybe the child will eat it, right? So they say here, since potentially a child might go over and ask for the bread and the Gentile would give it to him, then basically you could say any piece could potentially be eaten by a child and therefore it would be okay. V'ilav, but if not, if they won't give it to even to kids, right? Obviously people usually are more nicer to kids. They see a kid, right? The kid looks at them in a certain way, asks in a nice way. They'll be nice. A grown up, they'll say, go figure it out yourself. So if not, they won't even give it to a child, then you can't. So then I say, wait a minute. This contradicts a Beitzah. Let's see in the Beitzah. Maaseh b'Shimon haTimni. There was this maaseh that happened, an action, a case that happened with Shimon haTimni. Shelo ba emesh lebeit hamidrash, right? This ever happens, you don't show up, and sometimes you don't show up someplace and you get upset that nobody noticed you were missing. Sometimes you don't show up and you kind of hope no one realized I wasn't there. Well, it was noticed that he didn't show up to the Beit Midrash. In the morning, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava sees him and says, Amar lo, what happened? Amar lo, right, this is like all sorts of excuses you can make, right? Like my dog ate my food, so my dog ate my homework, right? So here, so a whole fleet of people came in and we had to cook for them, right? They wanted to take everything. Sorry, we didn't get to the cooking part. They wanted to take everything from us. It was obviously Yom Tov. Okay, we slaughtered a calf and we gave it to them. And they left in peace, right? All's well that ends well. Amar lo, tameani im lo yatzas charchem be'apseitchem. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says to him, I'm not so sure you won out here. I'm not sure if the reward you got that they left is worth the hefsed, the fact that you cooked on Yantif when you weren't allowed to. The Torah says, you're not allowed to cook for Gentiles. V'amai. So now the Gemara asks, why? Potentially, it was food that they could have eaten with themselves. So Rav Yosef, Rav Yosef says, no, it was actually a treifa animal that they slaughtered. So really, it was Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava got upset with him because they fed him a treifa. It meant the Jews definitely couldn't eat that meat because it was non-kosher meat that they gave them. But wait, dogs can eat it. We could have given it to our dogs. So they say, well, Tinai, it's a machloket tanaim, whether or not ochal nefesh applies to dogs or not, or really to animals. So let's see. So basically, we're going to say that Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, who was questioning him, obviously held by the opinion that you can't give it to your dog, in which case he said, it's not good for you, it's not good for your dogs. How were you, you're not allowed to cook for dogs, you're not allowed to cook for Gentiles. How did you do this? So how do we know it's a machloket tanaim? Titanias, it says in a Beitzah, you're allowed to do for yourself what anyone is allowed to eat. So who's allowed to eat here? L'chol nefesh, any nefesh, any soul. What does that include? It sounds like even animals. How do we know? So we're going to quote a pasuk that talks about the soul of an animal. If you hit an animal, the soul of the animal, then you have to pay. So therefore, you might have thought that nefesh includes animals. However, Talmud Lomar, lachem v'lo leklavim. Lachem comes say just for you. That's asher yachel l'chol nefesh hu levado yaseh lachem. Only that you're allowed to do for yourselves. Yourselves come to say just you, not dogs, not animals. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Rabbi Akiva Omer, afilu nefesh behema b'mashma. No, this actually includes animals. This is the machloket that we mentioned. Im kematom olom lachem. So what does lachem exclude? Lachem v'lo lovdei kochavim, not Gentiles. Uma ra'ita. So now the classic question, when you come to include one thing and exclude the other, according to this opinion, Gentiles are out, but dogs are in. Uma ra'ita l'rabot et haklavim u'leotzi et ovdei kochavim. The answer is obvious. Marbani et haklavim shemazonotan alecha. You're responsible for your dog's food. Therefore, you're allowed to feed your dog, make food for your dog. It's included in ochal nefesh, according to Rabbi Akiva, because your dog's your responsibility, whereas the Gentile is not your responsibility. Right? We're talking about Gentiles that are their own people. They're not belonging to you. They're not yours. And they're responsible for their own food. So therefore, we don't allow you to cook for them. Rav Yosef now says okay, so that's the answer we had to the question why Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava questioned him, because really he held that it's not good if it's good for your dogs, and it was non-kosher meat, so it wasn't good for them. How could they have done it only for the Gentiles? He doesn't relate here to the obvious question, which is, well, what if they were going to kill them, right? Maybe it was pikuach nefesh. Obviously, you'd have to say it wasn't pikuach nefesh, that they were going to, the army was going to attack them. If not, I don't know how you get around that. But okay, that's an aside. I didn't look up what the commentaries say about that. I imagine it comes up somewhere. Now let's go back to this opinion of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, that you can't cook for dogs or Gentiles. So if you can't feed your dogs, then these are date pits that they give to dogs. How do they give it to them in Yantif? We see the people do this. How do they do it? Okay, we're basically going to say, now this isn't, they're not cooking it, but what are they doing? It's muktzah. Date pits are not valuable for anything. So they're muktzah. How do we give it to the dogs? How do we give it to them? Amar le. What do you mean? They're not muktzah. You can burn them. You can use them in a fire. Date pits. We learned that back in Masechet Shabbat. You can use them in a fire. So tinach biyabeshta beretiv tamai kalamemer. So that's the dry ones. What about moist ones that aren't dried out yet, which don't really burn so well? So they're not valuable for anything on Yantif, usable for anything. Oh no, they are. Amalei chazu lehasek gadol. You can throw it in a huge fire, because in a huge fire, they'll dry instantaneously and then they'll be useful, or they'll take 5 minutes, but whatever it is, they'll be able to burn down the road. So it should be fine. So last question on this though, Tinach b'yom tov b'Shabbat ma'i kalamemer. Well, that's only on Yantif. But what about Shabbat? Shabbat, if you can use it for a fire, well, you can't make a fire on Shabbat. So how does it help you on Shabbat? So they say, mitaltalim lehu agav rifta kedishmon. So he says, you can carry it to and it's how do you feed your dog these date pits on Shabbat? On Yantif, they're not muktzah, we already said, no problem. On Shabbat, how do you feed them? You carry it to them on bread. Okay, Kiddush Shmuel, as Shmuel says. Now, Shmuel's topic was a little different, but Amar Shmuel, oseh adam koltzer kol b'pat. You can actually use bread for anything you need, meaning it's not disgraceful to bread. Okay, bread always has this level of respect for it. If you use bread, let's say, to carry something that's wet, that'll drip all over the bread and ruin the bread, you can't do that because it's called bizayon ochalim. You're disgracing food. You can't ruin food for your purposes, right? Sometimes people use food for other things. So you can use your bread as long as you're not ruining the bread. So to carry the date pits on it, you can do. So therefore you carry it on the bread you're allowed to carry. Therefore you carry the pits on the bread and all is good. That's how you feed your animal food that's muktzah on Shabbos. Now back to Rav Huna. What did Rav Huna say? Rav Huna said that you can bake for these Gentiles if there's a chance that they might give a little bit of it to a child. So that means if I'm baking for myself and a Gentile, it's no problem. But Pliga de Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi disagrees. And this comes out very interesting sugi here. From all sorts of purposes, all sorts of directions. We'll see as we learn it. You can invite a Gentile to your house for Shabbat. But you can't invite a Gentile to your house on Yom Tov. Why? We're worried that you might add on more food and cook for that Gentile. You can't cook extra for a Gentile. That's obviously very different from what Rav Huna said. He said, as long as it might be a Jew could eat part of it, it's okay to do. So this is a very interesting halacha. First of all, it comes out that we're more strict on Yantif than we are on Shabbat, right? About this issue, that you can invite Gentiles to your house on Shabbat, but not on Yantif. It's also a very interesting issue, not inviting Gentiles to your house. So this means, by the way, right, on the holiday when you're actually cooking, so that you might end up cooking for them, right? Maybe one could distinguish between, let's say you're inviting them for the night meal where you've already cooked all your food from before. It's a good question, right? Like many people invite for Seder, for example, Gentiles to their Seder, right? This wouldn't be such an issue necessarily unless you're cooking at the meal, and then he would view this as an issue, right? I'm not going into how we paskin on this. I didn't look it up, but it's an interesting debate here. So now, and we'll see, the more interesting thing is that it seems clear that they were inviting Gentiles to meals. Not only is this just a theoretical discussion, that'll become clear from the end of the sugya, that clearly this was happening, which is also just interesting in the thought that they, even then, had Gentiles they were friends with that they would invite to Shabbos or Yantif meals. So now they say, he goes even farther. He says there's halachic problems with inviting Gentiles for Shabbat. What is that? Mishum shiurei kosot. If they leave over wine in their glasses, what might happen? The shamash will come to clear off the table. He'll clear off the Gentiles, and that's forbidden because it's muktzah. Okay, why is it muktzah? First of all, the wine that a Gentile is drinking becomes what we call ye nesech, which is forbidden to benefit from, and therefore there's nothing we could do with this wine, and therefore it's a problem. To which they say, what are you talking about? What, you think it's muktzah? Why is it muktzah also? Because it's whatever's left at the bottom of your glass, you're just going to spill out. So that has no use, and then it becomes muktzah. So the Gemara is going to have a whole bunch of questions on this. Well, then our cups should also be muktzah because our cups, once we finish drinking them, then they shouldn't be able to clear off the table at all. So they say, no, they say, didan chazu l'tarnagolim. Ours you can give to a tarnagolim. Okay, you can give to a rooster. Ditunami chazu l'tarnagolim. But so you could give theirs also. They say, no, you can't because ditu isurei hana'anihim. They're forbidden to benefit from, so you can't give it to your rooster or your chicken. So then they say, but wait, it's in a glass. Because the glass is important, you could take the glass, even though it has in it something that's muktzah. Milo Amar Rava did Rava not say metaltalin kanuna agav kimte. Kanuna is a pan where they would put all the coals and all that and the twigs and everything would burn in there. You can carry it because of the ashes in it. Because the ashes, if you designate the ashes before Shabbos, said, I'm planning to use these to cover something in my house. Let's say if something gets dirty, I want to cover with ashes. Talked about that earlier in the Masechet. Then you can carry this because of that. So likewise, you carry the wine because of the glass. So that should be fine. They say no, right? Even though there's these broken twigs that are usable for nothing. So they say, no, it's different. Twigs are just useless. This is worse than useless because it's forbidden to benefit in any way. So really, he can't carry it. So how do we resolve this? Oh, we don't have to resolve it, by the way. This is why he says, don't invite a Gentile, because there is no resolution. The Gemara keeps trying to find a resolution, which in and of itself is interesting. So they say, because maybe they want to say, you should be able to invite Gentiles for Shabbat. Also, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi allowed it. So why don't we say this is like if there's feces in the middle of your floor, you're allowed to clean it because it's disgusting. Likewise, the dirty glasses with the wine in it, it's disgusting to leave on your table. Amarle, so maybe you'll say that, but you can't create a situation where you can't basically invite the Gentile knowing that he's going to leave over wine in his glass and knowing that you'll then have to allow it to be removed because it's disgusting. Avoid it, right? Don't put feces in the middle of your floor and then say, oh, I can move it because it's muktzah. Right? Obviously, they're very different situations. But it's interesting how far they go to say, don't invite someone because they're going to end up leaving over wine. By the way, they won't even necessarily leave over wine. So that makes it even more interesting. And right, in the event that they do, the shamash might move it and then it'll be permitted for him, but you shouldn't create a situation where you're going to permit him to do it because it's disgusting. You should try to avoid that situation from the beginning. So Rava Lamar Shmuel v'darash. So Rava taught Mar Shmuel and said, Mizamnim et hanochri b'Shabbat. Okay, he says we can invite a Gentile on Shabbat. Okay, or he said this to him. He said like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, but we don't do it on Yom Tov, so that you don't add for him. Here's the interesting story, because this clearly happened. It's not just we're talking theoretically. When a Gentile would show up at their house on Yom Tov, Amrule, and this is also just fascinating what they'd say to them, look, I made food for myself. If you're going to be fine with the food that I made already for myself, my family, then great, come stay. But just know I can't cook any extra food for you. So I'm going to cook whatever I was making for my family. And if you can manage to eat that, great. If not, sorry, but I really don't have any extra food for you, right? It's almost like it's a weird kind of invitation. It's like saying to your friend, listen, I want you to come for Shabbat lunch. I know it's last minute. Come, I don't really have food for you, but I'll make do with what I have, right? Which you could say, right? And that's basically what he's saying. That's what they would say to Gentiles. And with that, they would kind of cover themselves for this issue of not cooking for them. Okay, next machlok. Even though you can heat up water for food, you can't heat up water to wash your legs. Unless it's water that you can use for drinking, and then you can use it for your legs also. But if it's not drinking water, then you can't warm it up. This is like the mitoch shutra shelo litzorech hutra shelo litzorech, right? Since we permit it when it's for a purpose like cooking, we then permit the same action for other things. You can make a fire, a bonfire, and warm up next to it. To which the Gemara asks, well, notice it didn't say Beit Shammai or Beit Hillel there. So they asked, who is this going according to? Divrei HaKolhi, Ushanu Lehu, the Beit Shammai, Bein Hanaat Kol Gufo, Lahanaat Ever Echad. Do we say even Beit Shammai agrees about warming up your body? Because that's your whole body, where he doesn't allow it for one leg or for both legs, but he will allow something for your whole body. He'll kind of include that under Ochel Nefesh's needs for your body needs. Or, oh, Dilma Beit Hillel Katane Le'ava Beit Shammai Lo Shane Lehu, or maybe Beit Shammai doesn't allow that either. So Tashma, let's learn from here. Beit Shammai Omrim Lo Yaseh Adam Medura V'Yitchamem Kenegda U'Beit Hillel Metichim. We see here that it's clear from this bright to the Beit Shammai don't allow the Medura. So it's the same topic basically. Once we allow lighting a fire for cooking, can we allow it also for warming you up? Beit Hillel says yes. Beit Shammai says no. New Mishnah. Shlosha dvarim Rabban Gamliel machmir k'divrei Beit Shammai. 3 ways Rabban Gamliel was strict like Beit Shammai. We're not going to understand them all so much yet. We'll learn them more tomorrow in tomorrow's daf. But you can't warm up. Okay, hatmana is when you would wrap, you would like heat up water and then wrap it with something to keep the heat inside. You can't do that on Yantif for Shabbat. If Yantif falls out on Erev Shabbat, you can't do it. B'Yom Tov. You can't, unclear what the sounds like it means, can't pick up a candelabra that fell on Yom Tov. You can't make thick loaves of bread because it's a lot more work. You can only make thin ones on Yantif. These were strict, the 3 things that Rabban Gamliel was strict about. Amar Rabban Gamliel, he said, from the time of my father's house, I remember, okay, so this is what I remember from my father's house. They would only make the very thin breads on Yantif. Says, well, what do you want from me? They said to him, your father was strict for himself, but he taught us that we could do it. So I don't know why you're being so strict. So now the Gemara asks about the first one. And as I said, we'll get more into depth into the other ones in tomorrow's daf. Hey Chidam, this case about Tomnim Tachamim b'Shabbat, right? Wrapping something around this hot water, heating up this hot water, wrapping something around to keep it hot. Why not? What's the case? Ida anach eruv tavshilin. If you put up an eruv tavshilin, which permits you to cook from Yantif to Shabbos, then what's the problem, right? My time of the Beit Shammai, who forbid. And ida lo anach eruv tavshilin. If you didn't put up an eruv tavshilin, then my time of the Beit Hillel. Then why does Beit Hillel say it's okay to do this? You can't do this if you didn't put up an eruv tavshilin. That's what permits you to cook on Yantif to Shabbos. Otherwise, you can't cook at all. Well, we'll see. Maybe you can. Amar Rav Huna lo'olam emalach shelo hiniach eruv tavshilin uchdei chayav sharu le'Rabbanan. Really, it's a case where you didn't make an eruv tavshilin, but the rabbis allowed you, even if you didn't make an eruv tavshilin, they allow you on Yantif to cook basics, the basics of the basics. Okay, and we're going to see this right now. Rav Huna l'tamei, he goes according to his approach to Amar Rav Huna, which is interesting to think that heating up hot water, that's a basic need. You have to have hot water on Shabbos. It's interesting. In this first source, we're going to see he actually doesn't talk about hot water, but in the next source that we'll see in tomorrow's daf, it does mention hot water. If you didn't make an eruv tavshilim, Rav Huna says, ofin lo pat achad, you can make 1 loaf of bread, umevashlin lo ktera achad, and you can cook one pot of food, umadlikin lo etaner, and you can light a candle. Okay, those are the basics that you can do. By the way, this seems to imply, and this whole thing about this, halacha l'maaseh, about whether your eruv includes also candle lighting. Could be that in order to light candles, you also need an eruv, right? Normally we think of an eruv as permitting food. It seems to permit candles here. And then there's a whole question. Some people even say, if you didn't have in mind that your eruv includes your candles, then you can't light candles on Yantif for Shabbat. Whole interesting thing about this. Anyway, we'll end with this and we'll see, right? Just one more thing. You can even give him a small fish. That's also considered a basic. Interesting about what they consider basics of a Shabbat meal. Okay, with that, we'll end for today. Have a good Yantif, Moadim l'Simcha, and we'll meet up again on after Yantif.